Hello everyone, I am Nitij and welcome to this tutorial where we will use React's Context API to create a dynamic dialog component. This session is designed to elevate your React skills by focusing on practical implementation and real-world applications. So imagine you are building a large-scale React application. One common challenge is managing the state across multiple components, especially when it comes to user interactions like opening and closing dialog boxes. How do we efficiently manage these reusable dialogues without prop drilling or cumbersome state management? That's where React's Context API come into play. They provide a clean and efficient way to manage state across our application. Now, let me show you the final product of what we are going to build today. So over here, this is a button with text open dialog with custom content. When I will click on this button, then this dialog will open up with some content like this text over here and a button with the label close. Now we can close this dialog either by clicking on this close button, or we can also do that by clicking on this dialog backdrop. Now let's see how we can implement this reusable dialog using the Context API. So this is Visual Studio Code and this is an empty boilerplate React project. The first thing that I will do is to create a folder for our dialog context. So for that I will create the contexts folder, and inside this folder I will create another folder with the name dialog, and I will create a file with the name index.jsx. Now the purpose of this dialog context is to hold or store the state of the dialog, such as if the dialog is opened up or not, the dialog content, the dialog props such as its styling information, or maybe some other attributes that someone may want to add to the dialog component. So the first thing that I will do is to create the React arrow function export component, and let's just name it as dialog provider, and let's export it as well. Now first I will create a dialog context, so const dialog context equals to create context. So now in this dialog provider we are going to add a bunch of state variables. The first one is going to be the is open state of the dialog, so is open and set is open, and for that we are going to use the useState. So useState hook, and then the default value is going to be false. The second state variable that we are going to need is the dialog content, so dialog content and then set dialog content equals to useState, and this is going to be null initially. And we are going to need another state variable which is going to be the dialog props for any custom props or properties that we want to set for the dialog. So set dialog props. This is going to be an empty object because we can simply spread these props when we are initializing the dialog. Now we need two functions. The first one is going to be to open the dialog, and the second one is going to be to close the dialog. So let's do that. Const open dialog equals to an arrow function. Alright, so in this open dialog, the arguments that we are going to provide is for the dialog content and also for the props of the dialog with the default value of an empty object literal. Now we can simply update the state variables by using the arguments which are being passed. So for the content we can simply call set dialog content, and we can also set the dialog props. So set dialog props with the props argument, and when the open dialog is called, then it simply means that we have to open the dialog. So we will simply set is open dialog to true. Actually is open to true because set is open is the function to change its value, but in any case Our open dialog function is created. Now it's time to provide the implementation for the close dialog function. So const close dialog equals to another arrow function. This time we don't need any arguments, so we are just going to set the isOpen's value to false to indicate that the dialog can no longer remain open. And we can also set the dialog content and dialog props to their initial values, with null for the content and with an empty object literal for the dialog props. And now it's time to export the provider of this dialog context. So for that, what we can do is we can simply call dialog context dot provider, and now when we will use the context, then it has to enclose children's. So for that we can simply render children over here, but then we will have to add the prop for the children as well so that we can use it. Apart from this, let's do one more thing, because we are going to export two things from over here. The first one is going to be the dialog provider, and the second one is going to be the dialogs context. So we can export the dialog provider directly from over here, and from the end we can simply export the dialog context with the name use dialog. So use dialog equals to this is going to be a function which is going to return use context, and by providing the dialog context as an argument. Now when we will return the provider, then we also have to expose the value of the provider. So the value is going to be an object, and it simply indicates what are the context values that we want to expose to the children which this provider is enclosing. So basically we want to expose all of these state variables and these two functions. So is open and dialog content, and also dialog props, and then open dialog and then close dialog. So is open, dialog content and dialog props, they will be used by the dialog component, and open dialog and close dialog are going to be used. Let's now save this code and let's now move on to create our dialog component. So to create the dialog component, I will create a new folder. Let's just call it as components, and in this components folder I will create another folder with the name dialog. Let's now create two files over here. The first one is going to be the index.jsx for our dialog code, and the second one is going to be index.css for our dialogs styling information. Let's provide the implementation for our dialog component. So hold on, RAFCE, and then this is going to be called as dialog component, and then let's first import the css file. So dot slash and then index.css which we created, and we will also use the use dialog context. So use dialog. All right, now in our dialog component we will create a backdrop, and then we will create the dialog container itself, and inside the dialog container there will be the dialog content and the dialog button. So what I will do is I will remove this dialog component from over here, and first let's create the div for the backdrop. Okay, so the backdrop content is okay, there will be no backdrop content actually, so I'm just going to close it over here, and I will simply add the on click event. So when the backdrop will be clicked, then we will have to close the dialog. So for that we will have to call the dialog contexts dialog contexts close dialog function. Now to use the close dialog function, we will have to destructure all the exposed object properties of the use dialog that we need to use on our dialog component. So let's do that. So is open, and then we will also need the dialog content and dialog props and close dialog equals to use dialog. So isOpen will simply indicate if the dialog needs to be opened or not. Close dialog will be used to close the dialog when either the backdrop will be clicked or when the close button will be clicked. So this is our backdrop, and then let's add the div for our dialog content. So I'm just going to directly render the dialog content. It can either be plain text or it can be another JSX content as well. So after this, I'm going to add a button with the text close and with the on click event, simply calling the close dialog function. And yeah, that's everything I guess we need to do. Now in our dialog component, we need to add a state variable as well, using which we will know if we need to show the dialog or not. So let's do that. I'm just going to name it as show, and setShow is going to be the function to update it. So useState, and then the initial value is going to be false. And I will also add the useEffect callback over here, and this function is going to be called when the isOpen will be changed. So let's add the dependency array and wire it up with isOpen context property. So over here I will add a condition. If isOpen is true, then we will set the value of show to true by calling setShowTrue, and otherwise if it is false, then we will simply set setShow to false. Now how do we, or where do we use the show state variable? We are going to use it over here. If the dialog is not meant to be shown, then we will simply return null. Okay, I think our dialog code is done, and now it's time to implement the component where we are going to use it. But here is one more thing that we have not added, and that is the dialog props. So to add the dialog props, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to spread out the dialog props object in our content or the container div. And now I will create another component in this components folder with the name my component, where we will simply use the dialog. So let's create a new file with the name index.jsx. Now in this my component, I'm just going to first name it, so my component, and then we are not going to interact with the dialog component directly. Instead we will simply interact with the use dialog context by updating its values, and that can be done by simply calling open dialog. So from this component we can only ever call the open dialog, and the responsibility of closing dialog lies on the user to either click on the dialog's backdrop or click on the dialog's close button. So over here I will first destructure the open dialog function. So use dialog. Okay, and now let's add a button to our return statement. So button, and then the text is going to be open dialog, and for the on click event what we can do is on click we can create a new function. So let's do that. Handle click. So handle click is simply going to open the dialog. So open dialog, but we need to provide the argument values for the dialog content and the dialog props. So const content equals to, let's use a JSX over here. So let's add a paragraph. This is the dialogs content, and for the props, if you want to provide any custom props, then you can do that. Otherwise you can choose not to provide any argument for the dialog props. So now I'm just going to copy and paste handle click for the click event and save it. Now we have to use the my component in app.js, and we also have to use the dialog context as well. So open up app.js, and I'm just going to remove this default content from over here. Now the first thing in app.js that we have to do is, okay, let's remove this parent div as well and this logo import as well. Now the first thing that I will do is I will import the dialog provider, and I will import the my component, and let's also import the dialog component as well. Now the dialog provider will be used to enclose all the child components like the my component and dialog component. So because when we will enclose or provide the my component and the dialog component as the children for the actually it's going to be dialog provider as the children for the dialog provider, then they will be able to use the this provider's context values which it is exposing. So let's do that. Let's first add the my component, and let's add the dialog component as well. Now it can either be added on the top or at the very bottom, but the purpose to add or to render the dialog component from the app.js file is to simply have a single copy of the dialog and not have every other component which needs to open up a new dialog simply render a new dialog in the HTML DOM, because that is going to be expensive performance wise when multiple copies of the same dialog components are going to be rendered. So let's save it, and now it's time to run our code and see if it is working or not. So for that I'm just going to run in the terminal npm start. Now let's click on this button open dialog, and when I have clicked on it, then the dialog has appeared. But you know what, this is not very dialog like, because I mean there is no backdrop and the dialog is appearing in the top right corner instead of appearing in the center, and that is because we have not provided any styling information. So let's provide this styling information, which is one of the most crucial parts. First let's open up index.jsx to see what we need to style. So for backdrop, it needs to be a fixed div, because it will have the top, left, right and bottom property values as 0, and then it will have a semi-transparent translucent background black color. For the dialog container or the dialog box, its position also needs to be fixed in the center, and we will add some other styling information as well. And I will add one more thing or one more feature to this dialog, and that is animating the transitions of the dialog. Like when the dialog will be opened, then that opening transition will be animated, and when it will be closed, then that will be animated as well. So let's open up the index.css file, and first I will add the class for the dialog backdrop. So dialog backdrop, my bad. Okay, the position is going to be fixed, and okay, hold on, top is going to be 0. I guess my keyboard is not working properly today. Well, anyways, top is going to be 0, and left and bottom and right is going to be 0. And we have to add or set the background color. So background color is going to be RGB with an alpha value, so RGBA, and then it's going to be black but with semi-transparent alpha value. Let's also set the Z index, because our dialog and dialog backdrop needs to appear at the very top of all the other components or UI elements which are there in the page. So I'm just going to set the Z index as 999. And for animation, what we can do is, let's add keyframes for animating the opening in and closing of the dialog. So for that I will simply add keyframes for fade in of the dialog and fade out of the dialog. So for fade in, for from, or for the initial value, I'm going to set the opacity as 0, and then 2, or for the last or the final value, the opacity is going to be 1. Similarly, let's add the keyframes for fade out. So from is going to be 1 and 2 is going to be 0, which simply means that we are going to hide the dialog in its final keyframe. And now we can use the fade in animation for our dialog backdrop when it will be opening. So animation is going to be fade in. Let's use the duration as 0.3 seconds, and it is going to ease in out, and also use forwards only because it will not animate backwards. Okay, now let's add the class for our dialog container or dialog box. So dialog box, let's set the position as fixed for this one as well, and to center it, I'm just going to set the top and left as 50%. So top and left are 50%. Let's set the transform property as well. So translate -50 and -50. Okay, why are there two curly brackets over here? Okay, let's remove them. Now set the background color as white. So, and padding, let's add the padding as well for the content. So let's add the padding as 20 px. Now for z index, we need to use a value which is higher than 999 because the dialog should appear on top of the backdrop. So let's use 1000, and let's also copy the animation property value from over here because we are going to use fade in keyframes over here as well. Let's also set the border radius too. So border, okay, hold on, forwards and semicolon, border radius, let's set the value as 20 px. Now let's add one last class, and that is to animate the hide or closing animation for both the backdrop and the dialog. So for that, I'm just going to set the animation property value. Let's copy it from over here, but instead of using fade in, we are going to use fade out. And yep, that's everything that we need to do for the classes. And now it's time to use these classes in the dialog component. Now let's start with the backdrop by adding the class name for it. So I am going to add or use a template string. So dialog backdrop is the class name. Now what we can do is, if is open context property is true, then we can actually, if it's not true, then we can simply hide the dialog. Otherwise we can simply provide an empty string to add nothing. Similarly, for the dialog box as well, we can provide the class name. So let's use dialog box class name over here, and the same expression or condition. And what else we need to do? Now there is one thing that we need to manage, and that is the hiding of our dialog, which is based on the keyframes. If is open is set to false, then we cannot immediately hide the dialog because then it will render null. We have to wait for the keyframe animation to finish, then only we should completely hide the dialog. Now there can be multiple ways to do it. The most reliable way in which I found this can be done is to use set timeout when we have to hide the dialog. So with set timeout, we can provide a callback function, and in this callback function I am simply going to set the show variables, the show state variables value to false. and I'm going to use 300 milliseconds or 0.3 seconds, which we used for our animation duration. So after 300 milliseconds, this function is going to get called, and when set show will be false, then the dialog will stop rendering. So then we can safely assume that the keyframes have finished and the dialog can be removed from the DOM. Now the same logic has to be applied in our dialog context as well. So let's open up the context first. Now when we will be closing the dialog, then instead of setting the dialog content and dialog props directly to the default values, we have to use set timeout here again to first wait for the keyframes to finish. So set timeout, and we have to provide a callback function. So I'm just going to cut and paste these two statements over here, and then again use the duration, after which this callback function is going to get called as 300 milliseconds. Now I think that is pretty much everything we need to do for the dialog component and the context. Now let's see if our code is working as expected. So open the dialog, but the backdrop is not showing up. Let's check why the backdrop is not showing. So there is a typo in the background colors function name. So instead of RGBA, I have written RBGA. So this should be RGBA. Alright, now let's save it and check again. So this time we can see the backdrop as well, or the backdrop's background color. The backdrop was showing previously as well because we were able to close the dialog while clicking outside of it, but its color was not showing up. So yep, I think now the dialog is working as expected. So guys, I hope this tutorial video has given you valuable insights and practical skills that you can apply in your projects. If you found this tutorial helpful, then please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support encourages me to create more content like this and helps our community grow. Remember, if you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. Let's learn and grow together as a community. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next tutorial.